would like to welcome you to this session of our webinar series on global issues and critical perspectives that we do here at the Center for Global Studies. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm directing the Center for Global Studies, and jointly with my colleagues here, we put on this webinar to connect scholars, experts with policymakers and civil society at large. And we've been fortunate enough to partner with the EUCAnet project, the EU-Canada network, and also being funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. So I would like to acknowledge their support. Today, we're going to look at one of the critical questions of our time, fighting climate change. For some people, it is the decisive question for our political world for the 21st century. How do we effectively respond to the fundamental challenge that is posed by climate change to a warming world? And there seems to be a growing sense of frustration and, for some people, a sense of desperation when it comes to the inadequate way in which we respond as a global community to something that will affect people around the world, that we already see having effects in terms of a higher occurrence of floods, of storms, of wildfires. The effects of climate change starts to be felt around the world. Yet when we look at the policy responses, even through the very ambitious goals that we set ourselves at the global scale with the 2016 Paris Agreement to keep global warming under 2%, there seems to be a real deficiency. Countries simply fall short on their commitments, and including the country where we are based here in Canada, the promises made seem to be very hard to live up to in terms of concrete policy changes. Let me just allude to these, what I describe as a conundrum or paradoxes of climate change by citing two important contributors to the debate. Sir David Attenborough here, you see him speaking about a fundamental civilizational challenge. And we've heard in October 2018 from the experts in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we really only have 12 years left to react in a way that would allow us to keep global warming at an acceptable rate under 2 degrees, ideally at 1.5%. And more recently, over the past 2 weeks, we heard the UN report on the unprecedented rate of species extinction that is accelerating, that 1 million species are threatened immediately by extinction, partly due to climate change and our approach to the environment. So how come that there isn't a greater degree of urgency when it comes to reacting politically in terms of policy responses? And then you see here, that was last week, and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stating that what we have, we need this strong political will, but what we see might actually be the opposite, a paradox that in particular populist right has now identified the issue of global warming in different ways and pushing back and investing a lot in climate change denial. Here in Canada, we have a very vivid debate about the legitimacy of carbon pricing and carbon tax. It becomes a political issue in which we have also very, substantial amount of actors that are not willing to engage and address climate change as an urgent issue in policy terms. And before I turn it over to our first speaker, let me just reflect on some of the challenges that we face in terms of effective policy responses. The first, you could argue, is that climate change and addressing it in an effective way is something that poses a scope or a nature that is often very hard to address in mainstream politics. You think what climate change would involve for our economy, it would be basically touching all aspects of our social and economic life if we addressed it effectively. And that often scares politicians to even think about the fundamental reform that will be necessary for our economy. The second point here is that there is the challenge of this global scale of the phenomenon. We are used to addressing these policy issues in national arenas, find legitimacy and effective way in enforcing policies. This is truly a global challenge, and we don't have mechanisms of policy development and enforcement in place to address the issue at a scale at which it would be necessary. And the third point here is the temporal scope of the policy challenge. Think about how politicians govern. They govern in electoral cycles of 4 years. And the challenge that we have and the scope of the challenge often requires long-term investment and long-term policy approaches that politicians often see to be too risky and too costly with a view to being re-elected and their political success. So that's a fundamental challenge to a political system of how to deal with these long-term challenges. And the last one here is corporate power and very vested interest in the carbon industry to protect the interest of a highly fossil fuel intensive industry in terms of public discourse, in terms of access to power, and very vested interest in investment and so forth. So as we look at these key challenges to this policy issue, we get a sense of how come that maybe it takes a 16-year-old Swedish girl to push politicians to action. Has the momentum shifted? And that's one of the questions that we would like to address in our webinar today. The relative inaction of our elected leaders. Has this triggered, and should it trigger a greater degree of action and momentum shifting to civil society, to different levels of government and non-governmental agencies intervening in the debate and pushing us towards more coherent and effective action? And before I now come to introduce our distinguished speakers who will help us to address those issues, let me just remind you online that you will have the ability to intervene later, after the two relatively short presentations in our chat box. So you won't be able to use audio, but you will be able to type. You will see the chat box soon to type in your comments and questions after our two presentations. With this having said, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Miranda Schreurs, who is a professor and chair of climate and environmental policy at the Bavarian School of Public Policy, the Technical University of Munich. And Miranda investigates environmental movements, green politics, and climate policy making, both from a comparative and international perspective. And we're going to hear her experience of the European context, the EU context in particular. And as you can see here on the slide, Miranda has also a very distinguished experience in the policy community. In 2011, she was appointed by Chancellor Merkel, German Chancellor, as a member of the Ethics Committee for Secure Energy Supply, and in 2016 appointed to the German Bundestag as a member of a committee established to bring citizen voices and ensure greater transparency in the search for disposable site for highly radioactive waste. Also, Miranda Schreurs has been a member of the German Council on the Environment and vice chair of the European Advisory Council on Environment and Sustainable Development. So Miranda brings this wealth of experience both from the research side and the policy arena with a distinguished academic and scholarly career here, as you can see, having received her degree from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. So Miranda, it's a great pleasure bringing you in and hearing about your perspective on the European context in particular, and would like to invite you to give your presentation on European climate policies, grassroots activism, and policy change. And with this, I'm going to mute my mic and invite Miranda to take the stage by unmuting hers. Thank you very much, Miranda.
So thank you very much, Oliver. I appreciate that really nice introduction, and also the opportunity to speak with all of those who are part of this webinar. You know, for me, it's such an important issue, and it's really nice to see the kind of interest that those of you who are here are showing. And what I'd like to do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is just give you a bit of an overview of what the debate is right now in the European Union. Maybe we can begin. This might be common knowledge to all of you, but if you look at the trends in terms of carbon dioxide emissions over hundreds of thousands of years, scientists are suggesting that we are at a level of CO2 output right now that we haven't really ever seen in the humanity's existence. And that means that we are entering into a zone of unknown. So when we're talking about having to deal with this issue politically, it's really trying to deal with a science issue where the consequences could be extremely severe, and therefore we need what we call in Europe a precautionary approach. If you take a look at the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that Oliver mentioned, you see a range of scenarios that they are producing. And on the left side, where it says A, you see a more yellow map of the world. And on the right-hand side, a much more red map of the world. And that is suggesting the differences we could have in terms of temperatures within the next century based on what we choose to do now and how much action we take now on climate policy. And if you look at what's going on globally with CO2 emissions, from the time we always talk about pre-industrial emissions, those are emissions that are 1750 to 1800, and you can see how low those are on this map. And what we're talking about now is the need to drastically reduce our emissions because of what we've been doing over the last 150 to 200 years, with the concern that if we don't, temperatures will increase. So if you look at the Paris Climate Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement was the first global effort. Before that, we had an effort called the Kyoto Protocol, but this is the first global effort to try to do something about this problem. And so in the negotiations in 2015, which led to the eventual ratification of the Paris Agreement, we agreed globally to try to keep those temperatures from not going above 2 degrees centigrade of that pre-industrial level, and to strive for not more than 1.5 degrees centigrade, because a lot of island nations said if we go above 1.5 degrees centigrade, it's suicide for us. We're in trouble. And so the countries, including the European Union, established nationally determined contributions, basically voluntarily saying what they plan to do. And in the case of these efforts, what we're seeing is that maybe we're not quite doing enough, that those nationally determined voluntary contributions aren't going to get us to the 1.5 degree limit. It's estimated that if we don't change path, then by as early as 2030, and conceivably a couple decades later, we could be at that 1.5 degree average temperature increase. So the United Nations also last year warned we're not doing enough, and especially the rich countries, the G20, which would include, of course, the European countries and also Canada, our contributions are too low. Well, what are those contributions? In the case of the European Union, back at the time that the Kyoto Protocol was really still the main issue, Europe set a goal of 20-20-20 by 2020. Easy to remember. 20% CO2 emission reductions, 20% energy efficiency improvements, 20% renewable energy in the final energy mix. And those CO2 emission targets were relative to 1990 levels. Well, we're now a step further. Europe is pretty close to meeting those 2020 targets, but now it's time to be thinking about 2030 and 2050. So back in 2014, Europe started to debate what should it be doing, and instead of the 2020 targets, we now have the 2030 targets. with a goal for a 40% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030 compared to 1990, 27% renewables, and then 27% energy efficiency. Now, Europe reacted to those reports that came out from the United Nations and from the IPCC that said we're not on track. So Europe has, in the last year, actually tried to improve its targets. So now there's a 32% renewable energy target and a 32.5% energy efficiency target. That all sounds good, and actually we see a lot of stuff going on the ground, a lot of people like these pioneers, the Slovacs, who actually helped to launch the bottom-up revolution on climate change action in Germany, who basically took it in their own hands and said, we've got to act. But even with all of that, it's not enough. And you can see where we're going with our current policy trajectory relative to where we actually need to go. And actually, even getting down to 20% of 1990 levels isn't really enough. We really need to get down to about 95% of those 1990 levels. That means here in Europe, that means in Canada, that means in the United States. African countries, developing countries will be given a little bit more time, but it means for the industrialized countries, a lot of action needs to happen. And Europe has been making other nice policies and plans. The European Commission Planet for All, which is saying by 2050, let's be climate neutral, which means basically all buildings have to be net zero emission buildings, i.e. you don't basically need any energy in order to heat them or cool them. In a system totally based on renewables, clean, safe mobility, a circular economy, a bioeconomy, all sounds great. The question is, are we on track? Emissions have decreased. 2013 to 2017, emissions decreased by 3% in the power sector. But look, transportation emissions are increasing by 7%. And aviation emissions are increasing by 4.5% from 2016 to 2017. That's not going in the right direction. And Germany is a particularly interesting example. In some ways, Germany is considered a real pioneer, a real mover on climate change. And it's done quite a lot on reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. They're 27.5% below 1990. But actually, Germany had a target to reduce by 40% by 2020. There's no way Germany is going to get to minus 40%. Renewables are expanding, but only in the power sector. Nothing's been going on in the transport sector. Nothing's been going on in the building sector. And so, finally, pressure's building, and now we see in Germany a committee that said, okay, we need to phase out coal by 2038. But to be honest, that's not enough for the 1.5 degree target. And that's where Oliver started us off with to say, what's going on with this new set of voices that are out there, the Fridays for Future group, that is a group of teenagers who basically said, this is our future, it's our lives, and you are leaving us a planet that's going to be in deep trouble. We're starting to scream. Extinction's Rebellion, same thing, basically saying we are willing to get ourselves arrested in order to get the media to pay attention to probably the most serious problem the planet has ever faced, at least in the time that humans have existed, and we're not paying enough attention to it. We're taking this as like, oh, well, we'll get there by 2050, maybe we'll wait a little longer, and then we'll act. And so we're starting to see something I haven't seen in a long time. We're starting to see really calls for action, and that's pretty amazing. The British Parliament last week said, we're declaring a climate emergency. Ireland has declared a climate emergency. Last week, the first German city, Konstanz, declared a climate emergency, and it's one of only hundreds of local governments that are starting to say, okay, you teenagers, we're hearing your voices, And maybe we do have to start taking this more seriously. But as Oliver said, the big question really is even this going to be enough of a push? Because there are a lot of interests to say, well, we'd like to keep coal in the system as long as possible. And so from my perspective, I'd say we're making progress, but still not enough, and we need a whole lot more people to say we need to act now.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Wonderful how you led us from the high-level policy development in the European Union to, showing us how, in a way, the momentum might shift to more voices being heard and instilling a greater sense of urgency on the ground, also to push politicians to do something. And that seems to be one of the major challenges, right? To really get to where we need to be. We know it, and that's, in a way, the paradox. We have the knowledge. We look at the cliff that we could, already feel to a certain degree in terms of the fundamental changes that climate change will cause on the planet, and yet the push for action, it seems to be not strong enough in this respect. Okay, with this, we're going to move to Ben Eifert. Let me see. We just need the PowerPoint here, and I think we are uploading. Sorry. The technology normally works quite well. We are almost getting there. If not, I could. I think we're just uploading the latest version here. If not, I'm going to introduce Ben differently. I think, here we go. All right, Ben, I think that's you already, but I would like to go back here for a second. Okay, is this your presentation, Ben? I guess so, right? Okay, so let me present Ben Eifert here, who is has been a counselor in Victoria City Council for the past 8 years, and at the same time, he is a very distinguished scholar as an historian who has written about BC Canadian history, has taught at the University of Victoria, and combined his scholarly work with a very fundamental commitment to working in the community, both through local government, but also more broadly social issues of inclusion, of poverty, and for today's session, most importantly, issues of environmental policies and climate change. So Ben, it is wonderful to have you join us and give us perspective from where we're trying to get it. The grassroots perspective, Miranda already referred to different levels of government and the role that cities play in this respect. So with this, I would like to hand it over to you, Ben, to give us your perspective from the Victoria dimension and the Victoria perspective, and more broadly, a kind of grassroots response to the challenge of climate change.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Miranda, for your presentation. Thanks for the other organizers, and thank you to all the participants. This is my first webinar, so it's nice to be introduced to the technology. In terms of advancing the slides, I think I have a button right here. So apologies in advance if there's any clunkiness with my virtual conference. So climate change is the issue of our times, in terms of it both being a social issue and an ecological issue. And I think we are seeing one of the great social movements emerge in response to this challenge. And I think the social movement mobilization we're seeing reflects the inadequate response by state actors at all levels of authority and in all jurisdictions. And I'm a historian rather than a futurist, so I can't really predict where things will go. But I think whether or not humanity manages to adequately grapple with this challenge will largely depend on the effectiveness of social movement mobilization. And so this is the graphic for a very recent organization that's formed in the United Kingdom. Extinction Rebellion was formed just last fall to help spearhead direct action in response to the climate emergency in that country. This movement succeeded just last week in having the conservative government of that country declare a climate emergency in response to a resolution from the Labour Party opposition. And as I mentioned, Extinction Rebellion has embraced the tactics of direct action and nonviolent civil disobedience, mobilizing 1,000 people who risked arrest, who were arrested, and many more who've joined in other ways. There was the shutdown of central London in terms of at least 4 different sites of protracted occupations lasting several days, so public squares, bridges, and in a very deliberate campaign of disruption aimed at putting climate change and climate justice to the top of the political map in that country and beyond. And different elements of the climate justice movement calling out the lack of accurate information coming from decision makers, coming from sections of the media, other sections of society, and a very overt anti-capitalist orientation in terms of attributing responsibility for the climate emergency to the current economic structure of human society, in terms of the profit system aimed at exploiting the maximum wealth from ecological systems and from human labor. And an interesting linkage there between the climate justice movement and the labor movement, which has been one of the most vital social movements in Western societies for the past 150 years, and that common linkage in terms of an anti-capitalist critique. And seeing the role of youth, which has been mentioned by the previous speakers, so Greta Thunberg, the Swedish teenager, pushing her case on a constant basis for a big chunk of the last year, and spearheading a mobilization that last month, or I guess it was the March climate strike, mobilized an estimated 1.4 million young and not so young people globally, including in my community, the city of Victoria, where approximately 3,000 young and older people converged on the provincial legislature in a high school student-led mobilization. And so in British Columbia, Indigenous movements have also been integral to the climate justice movement and the linkage of issues in terms of Indigenous rights, ecological issues, and also broader social rights. And I think when we look at the climate justice movement in British Columbia and the alliance between Indigenous people, environmentalists, and other segments of society, there's some connections to other social movements in the Americas, particularly some Latin American movements, for example, Evo Morales' movement towards socialism party, which succeeded in securing state power in Bolivia. Morales, an indigenous person, the first indigenous head of state of that country, a former union leader. And there's certainly been tensions between the Morales government and environmentalists and others. But it's interesting when we look at the way the Bolivarian state has been structured since Morales' victory, there's an overt recognition of the intersectionality and the diverse interests that have come together in that coalition, in terms of a recognition of the struggles of the past, the depths of history, the plural composition of the state, anti-colonial indigenous uprisings, popular struggles for liberation, indigenous social and labor marches, struggles for water, for land and territory to construct a new state. And so this is a fairly dynamic articulation of the connection between social movement struggle and state activity in the 21st century that, if not a model, at least can inform efforts in other jurisdictions globally. Here in British Columbia, we've seen sections of the working class gravitate behind the environmental movement and the climate justice movement. So leading labor unions, including Unifor, which is a union representing auto workers, pulp workers, even pipeline workers, the BC Federation of Teachers, the BC Government Employees Union, have joined forces with First Nations to challenge fossil fuel infrastructure expansion, and particularly the expansion of oil pipelines connecting the oil reserves in the interior of the continent, in the Alberta oil sands, with export facilities on the British Columbia coast. Unifor was one of the labor organizations and one of the civil society organizations that made submissions to the National Energy Board in its deliberations relating to the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project, which is the major pipeline debate and proposal being considered in Canada at this time. Last year, the controversy relating to that issue motivated the government of Canada to purchase the pipeline, the 60-year-old pipeline, stating that the project was in the national interest, after private industry indicated it was no longer interested in proceeding in the face of Indigenous and environmentalist opposition. And so that project continues to go through a bit of a circular path. The Federal Court of Appeal of Canada struck down a permit to construct the pipeline last summer, this citing inadequate consultation with Indigenous peoples, and also the failure of the Government of Canada and the National Energy Board to properly consider the impact on the southern resident killer whale population, which is an endangered species that would be impacted by the project and the sevenfold increase in oil tanker traffic through the body of water known as the Salish Sea, just off of the coast of Victoria and Vancouver. So the quashing of that permit by the federal court prompted a renewed and expedited round of consultation by the National Energy Board. That consultation took place over the fall and early winter this year, and now the decision rests once again with the Government of Canada as to whether or not to proceed with the project. There's indications that there may be an announcement next month. Potentially it could be pushed back until Canada's next federal election, scheduled for October. On Vancouver Island, where I live, there's been political impacts as a result of these pipeline debates. The Green Party of Canada won its first legislative seat about 8 years ago on Vancouver Island, and just last week, a week ago yesterday, the Green Party secured its second elected seat in Canada's Parliament. And this was viewed certainly as a victory by the Greens. It was also viewed as a defeat for Canada's traditional left party, the Labour-aligned New Democratic Party, which has been somewhat inconsistent in terms of its policy towards oil and gas infrastructure. And just in the past week, since this political earthquake, the New Democratic Party has signaled a shift towards a stronger climate justice policy. And so it'll be interesting to see how these debates unfold in the upcoming federal election, and also what the climate justice movement and the politics of pipelines means for the configuration of the Canadian left. And here in the city of Victoria, where I serve as an elected official, we've been taking different measures to pursue climate action. One of these measures includes advocacy for the elimination of user fees for public transit. This is a policy that national jurisdictions, particularly Luxembourg and Estonia, have adopted this year. It's also a policy in place in many municipalities in Europe. But in the Canadian context, other than a small resort town in Quebec, Mount Tremblant, which just implemented free transit, this is a policy that has not yet been adopted in the Canadian context. In Greater Victoria, the region where I live and Oliver lives, a community of a little bit more than 413,000 residents is the latest population count. Emissions from transportation account for more than half of community-based greenhouse gas emissions. So the motivation behind the push for free public transit and substantially improved transit service is the idea that if we can shift transportation and substantially reduce private automobile use, that could potentially be the single biggest act in terms of climate action locally and the reduction of climate changing greenhouse gases. There's a grassroots citizens coalition pushing for this free transit campaign. I'm working closely with them. We were at an organizing meeting yesterday. There's a petition that's been circulated. A number of civil society organizations have endorsed this demand alongside the City of Victoria. So the Sierra Club of British Columbia, the Greater Victoria Teachers Association, the University of Victoria Student Society, and a number of other community organizations. A key decision point in this campaign will be a meeting of the Regional Transit Commission taking place next month. That's the governing body that determines transit fares and transit service levels in the capital region of British Columbia. Another initiative we've pushed in the City of Victoria is examining litigation against fossil fuel companies to hold them responsible for costs incurred by our municipality and other municipalities in relation to climate change. Climate change is resulting in hundreds of millions of dollars of costs for municipalities, everything for requirements for more robust seawalls and stormwater systems to deal with volatile precipitation levels and rising sea levels. Also operating costs relating to planning for climate change and responding for both climate mitigation and adaptation. Many communities in British Columbia are also impacted by increasing wildfires, which have been prevalent the last 2 summers. Well, they're prevalent every summer. The last 2 summers, they resulted in very poor air quality, and essentially a haze that blocked out the sun in most of British Columbia for a big chunk of the months of August. So climate change, the impacts of climate change have now become apparent, at least in the summertime in this corner of the world. This idea of climate change litigation is not new. It's been pursued by a number of local governments in the United States. It is a novel area of the law in Canada. And Osler is a leading corporate law firm in Canada. Shortly after the City of Victoria adopted a resolution to examine climate change litigation, this was the article that Osler Law sent out to its corporate climate clients, signaling the arrival of climate change litigation in Canada. There's been a fairly substantial pushback to the City of Victoria's very tentative step in this direction. There's no notice of claim that's been filed in any court. Currently we're at the stage of examining options and encouraging other local governments to work with us. But certainly from Alberta, where the oil sector is based, the tenor of debate and opposition to this measure has been extremely strong. But Victoria continues to examine our options. And this is the infrastructure that's at stake in Alberta, or this is a site of the oil sands where it's extremely energy intensive, extremely damaging from the standpoint of biological diversity, where the surface terrain is stripped away, and then bitumen is extracted from sand through using a huge amount of water and energy, and a huge impact in terms of polluting natural waterways, including drinking water supplies for many indigenous communities, fishing habitat, and also the terrestrial ecosystem. And when we look at this idea of climate change litigation, that the article from Osler that I just showed, it signaled that regardless of where these lawsuits go and how long they'll take to pan out, just the reality of potential litigation is now a factor that shareholders and investors and corporate boards and corporate officers have to take into account as a part of their fiduciary duty to their shareholders. And when we think of the tens of billions, potentially hundreds of billions of dollars that are invested annually by the major fossil fuel companies, even beginning to shift a portion of that portfolio towards renewable sources and other lines of their businesses could potentially have a beneficial impact in terms of climate action that would dwarf whatever a small community like the City of Victoria could do in terms of our own spending municipally. So big issue, we'll see where that one pans out. And so that, I guess, concludes my introduction to what's going on the ground and also a bit more globally with the climate action movement. And I encourage everyone participating on this web conference to get involved at the grassroots local level in helping people like these ones fight to win. So I think whatever we can do to build the strongest possible grassroots movements in all of our local communities, engaging all the tactics from direct action to legislative changes. I think that's the only way that humanity is going to have a shot in the long run. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And everybody online, we just moved the chat box into the screen. So you have the opportunity to come up with your questions or observations. It would be great if you want to introduce yourself. Please feel free to do so. And thank you, Ben. You've shown us not only the spread of actions against climate change across different levels of government, civil society, but also different ways of engaging in this political fight, which is the traditional means that seem to gain in importance. That now that we feel the real impact of climate change on the ground, climate change mitigation, think about the costs involved with the wildfires, with the floods, with the storms. These things have real impacts in our economy, and they have a price tag. And so you could see how through this mechanism you have another way of addressing those concerns over the impact of climate change and how we could address it. So I think we got a taste, and also Victoria said it's a small city, and the impact on a global scale is minuscule. But I think what we see across North America, Europe, and beyond is that cities have taken initiative, and they are the sites where these policies are being pushed and implemented. And it's partly because of a lack of leadership from our national leaders that different policy actors have stepped up and said, if there is no action, we're going to do this and react in different ways, and we even push national actors into action. Miranda, do you want to comment on Ben while people might think about typing questions? Any comments on what you heard from the other side of the world, at least westwards from your perspective? Does it reflect what we see across Europe in terms of initiatives, grassroots initiatives, cities' role in this process?
Oh, very much so. One of the things that has kept a lot of us who have been working in this area for a long time going is exactly this bottom-up citizen activism that is really, it's played out in lots of different ways, like Ben suggested. So one of the things we see in Europe is actually hundreds in the meantime of cities that have declared they're going for 100% renewable electricity. And we see in the Netherlands, for example, what Ben was saying about citizens going to the courts. Citizens in the Netherlands took the government, the national government, to court in the Uganda legislation. And they basically said the role of the government is there to protect the people, and yet the government isn't really preparing to protect us against really serious threats. And so they sued the government, and the court upheld the suit, and a higher court upheld the suit. And it's basically forced the government to start doing much more on climate implementation. So I think that's an indication that people really can, from the bottom up, make a big difference. We've seen it also in terms of the movements in universities to have green campuses. We've seen it in terms of cities that used to be almost totally dependent on automobiles that have said, that's enough in terms of financing streets for cars. Let's have financing for bicycle paths. So I used to be in Berlin, and Berlin in the meantime has something like 600 kilometers worth of bicycle paths that have all been put in the last 15 years or so to move people forward on a cleaner kind of transportation. So it does suggest that there's an awful lot that we as individual people can do, but we do need to raise our voices. And I think what's nice is that these movements, they're really becoming global. It's no longer just a little pocket here and a little pocket there. We're really seeing people in the richest and the poorest communities all saying, this is serious, we need to act.
And what we see is also mutual learning from different communities, right? So you can communicate this, and cities are a good arena in which these best practices can be shared and transplanted from one place to another. So let me go to the first set of questions that have come in. I don't do this in the order they've come in, but because Miranda, you mentioned the role of universities, and I see Monica Wynn here thanking us and you, the speakers, and asking about the role of universities in this whole process. Specifically, one is, how can they act as an entity, as an institution, but also what is the role of research conducted at universities like the University of Victoria? As we know, sometimes the evidence that we have, the scholarly evidence, is simply neglected in politics. We have this evidence. We have, I'm not sure, 98% of all scientists agree on the severity of the challenge posed by climate change, but in politics, climate change denial, downplaying the whole problem seems to be still having quite a bit of currency. So could you, Ben or Miranda, speak to what the role of scholarly research is in this respect, and also the challenges that the public consumption of those research findings and the political use of them face in our world?
Did you want to go first, Miranda?
I'm not sure who wants to come in.
I can start and then have Ben jump in on the case of the University of Victoria. Maybe that would make sense. As a university professor, one of the things I see is more and more universities that are starting to have student groups. They're putting pressure on the administrators to say climate change matters. And they're doing it in two ways. One way is actually to say universities are some of the biggest climate greenhouse gas emitters in cities because they have big laboratories, they have engineering facilities, they do chemistry, and those are very energy intensive kinds of operations. So universities might like to look like they're small players, but in fact they're big players on climate. And on the question of science and research, of course universities are doing quite a lot of climate research, but one of the things a lot of universities still need to do is to make climate change part of the academic syllabus in every discipline. We need people thinking about climate in terms of transportation, in terms of building, in terms of the digital future, in terms of health. In every single issue area, we need to have people be thinking about climate change and what can be done. And that is not yet the case in most universities. But we are seeing the push coming from students. I see it here where I am in Munich, where the students are saying, come on, we should be leading this. We are some of the most educated people, and why aren't we actually at the forefront? So I'll turn it over to Ben now, and maybe you can say something about what's going on in Victoria.
Sure. I think the universities have two very distinct roles. So one of them is the research side. We wouldn't be talking about the 11 years left that humanity has to turn the ship around if it wasn't for the leading edge research coming from dozens, hundreds of scholars globally, and particularly the scholars engaged on the IPCC panel, so which issued that groundbreaking report in October. So at its root, scholarship is why social movements and decision makers in the public are seized by the climate emergency based on the rigor of historical scholarship into what's going on with the planet. And so that work has to continue, and there's also a number of subsidiary elements of research, everything from electric technology, so battery storage capacity, the technology relating to renewables, and all of the types of technologies, even building technologies and everything in between in terms of how do we reduce fossil fuel emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. The other, I think, character of universities is they're massive workplaces in local communities. They're University of Victoria, approximately 30, it's a workplace of 30,000 people. And if we think back to, again, a historical parallel of the labor movement, when historically have we seen regime changes? Often they'll take place when there's massive general strikes, when workplace after workplace after workplace walks out and uses their power in a very direct way in that fashion. And the idea of exercising workers' power as a means of climate action, I think is something that has to be talked about, and not just leaving the students to strike, but as Greta Thunberg, I believe it was last week, she raised the question, when does a general strike on climate change become a tactic that people begin to contemplate seriously? And I think academic workers, whatever their role in institutions, whether they're teaching, whether they're providing services within universities, certainly the student body, I think each, both individually and collectively, academic workers should consider what role they can play in exercising, basically embracing job action as a mechanism for climate action and to force decision makers to act.
Thanks, Ben. Let me pick on one of the last points that you made. You referred to Greta and the strikes, the school action, so forth. And Jon Venema, he raised the question, I think, addressing Miranda directly, because looking at the action and response by the student protest, how might it be different, or is it different from singular high-profile events such as Greenpeace and Jim Hansen's arrest, for example, a decade ago? So do we see a different quality in grassroots initiatives, right? Yeah, that's one of the critical questions, right? Is it just a blip again, some media attention, or is there something more sustainable and politically more influential brewing at the grassroots level, with something that we see now with the youth walking out on Fridays once a month? Is there something more, more persistent, sustainable, and influential in politics? What is your read of, the grassroots scope of taking action on climate change?
Are you to Miranda, right? Yeah, I think.
Is that going to be?
Yeah, Miranda, I think it was. But you can both. And is it different from what we've seen 10 years ago, right? Yeah. So whoever wants to, it's in this kind of chat room, it's a bit difficult to read body language. But Miranda, maybe you can go first, and then we go to Ben if we want.
Well, like Ben said, we can't read into the future, but one of the things that I think is different between now and 10 years ago, there is a much higher level of awareness on climate change. And although there's a lot of loud voices in terms of the climate skeptics, they are small in number. And the people who are really getting worried is the young generation, and they're speaking up, and it's much harder to tell a 16-year-old, just be quiet. These 16-year-olds know how to talk, and they know how to gather their friends and push for change. We had a comparable kind of situation here. There's a very big energy company that's been run on coal here in Germany called RWE. And they've been powering the country on coal for years and years and years. But the shareholders, some environmentalists bought some of the shares of RWE, and that gave them voice at the last big annual meeting of the company. And it was really terrific to see a young scholar, a very young person, a young woman, stand up against the head of the company, and he was telling about why coal needs to be in the system for the next several decades, and she just looked at him and said, "You are so full of it. You are wrong, and you've been saying that for decades, and now it's time to change and get on with it." What we've also seen is young people, and also not just young people, it's also older people who care. In Norway, they forced the pension system of the government to stop investing in coal. And I think that's where you can really see that our voices can make a difference. What will probably be critical from my perspective for Fridays for the Future or for extermination, not extermination, but thinking about what goes on with the next kind of climate movements, Extinction Rebellion, there we go. What we really need are continued innovative actions, and we need ideas. If it's just the same kind of protest, then the media will get tired of it. And actually, I think that goes to one of the other questions that you have from the group there. Is the media complicit in all of this? And in some ways, I think yes. The media, a lot of the media has been bought up by very powerful voices, very powerful individuals, often with conservative agendas. And maybe it's really important for us to think about how do we make sure that we have a free and democratic media that really plays along with the debate.
Thank you.
Sure,
Ben,
yeah,
do you
there's a lot of
want to add to
strands
this?
to the conversation. I think, I guess starting, yeah, I think the challenge in Canada is that I think public opinion is more seized of climate change as the issue and as a major issue than it's ever been before. And we're seeing more mobilization than we've ever seen. Until a few months ago, it was a very sort of, not a fringe movement, but very small in numbers and maybe bigger numbers specific to pipelines. But I don't think climate was even the major concern in terms of motivating many anti-pipeline protests. It was more the potential impacts on waterways and that kind of thing. But in the last few months, we've seen climate change emerge as the major social movement in terms of the numbers of people, the numbers of demonstrations, the intensity of the demonstrations, and also the militancy of the people participating in the demonstrations in terms of a willingness to be arrested and to challenge the state in direct ways. And so, but the disconnect in Canada is that we don't, at the provincial and national level, we don't have a single government that embraces climate leadership. When we actually look at the real policy outputs of every government in Canada, it's a story of subsidization for oil and gas development, and in many cases, outright hostility to the environmental movement. The new government of Alberta is saying it's setting up a special office to investigate and challenge and oppose the international environmental movement that's trying to keep the petroleum resources of that province in the ground, which is kind of the biggest single act for climate change that can be contemplated, given the situation. The federal government of Canada sort of talks out of all sides of its mouth, but again, it bought a pipeline. It has brought in the first national carbon tax in Canada, which is a step in the right direction, but at the same time, it's aggressively pursuing oil and gas development. In recent months, virtually every provincial government in Canada has fallen to the Conservative Party or various types of Conservative parties. I believe there's only one there's one Liberal and one New Democratic administration in the country. And that NDP administration in our province recently approved a massive liquefied natural gas project with envisioned something like $40 billion of investment and tax subsidies in the amount of about $4.5 billion. So in my opinion, that's not climate leadership. And so that's the challenge today, that the provincial and federal states are being led, the executive of all of those states and most of, if not all of the legislatures, have not embraced climate leadership, and they've actually embraced ongoing greenhouse gas pollution. And yet the social movements in many communities and public opinion in many communities is light years beyond where the decision makers are. And so that's why I think in the Canadian context, social movement mobilization and protest are I think the imminent requirement. In other areas where you have more collaborative levels of senior government, then focusing at the policy level, I think is more feasible but at this stage, I think ramping up the pressure to a level that those governments cannot ignore, to the point where those governments shift their policies, I think it is the challenge. And given that the meter's running, 11 years to go, it's not an intellectual exercise. It's more a question of what each person can do individually and collectively to make that change happen.
Thanks, Ben. Could I pick up on where what you just addressed, the collaboration between different levels of government and also the difficulties, in particular in federal states such as Canada? Sheldon asked a bit early on, could you briefly speak to any sense of collaboration between governments, such as coordinating country level and or city level climate emergency declarations? For example, are countries in Europe considering amongst themselves a more coordinated approach to climate emergencies? So Miranda, that in a way speaks to the European context, where we do have different levels of governments, one additional one compared to the Canadian context, the European Union taking some kind of leadership to a certain degree, but often not having the means also of enforcing these kind of measures. Do you see this to be a viable option, or what are the obstacles? I think Ben just described how Canada is deeply divided at the provincial level. What action to take, vested interest in the oil industry in Alberta. We just elected recently a conservative populist leader in Ontario, who was, one of the first things was to be going to challenge the carbon tax in the courts. Do you see similar developments in the European context in terms of multi-level government's approaches to addressing climate change, Miranda?
Yes and no. One of the things that's pretty striking is that the European Union is 28 countries, at least as long as Britain stays in. With these 28 countries, you have quite a lot of diversity in terms of the energy structures. So maybe the equivalent of Alberta in Europe would be Poland. Poland is 80% dependent on coal for its energy structure. And then you have other countries like France that are very heavily based on nuclear. And Germany is kind of a mix of coal, and increasingly we're about 40% renewables in the electricity system now. So one of the things that's amazing is that despite this diversity, there's a pretty strong consensus in Europe that climate action is really, really critical. And I think one reason it's been possible here is because of the way the debate happens. And I think that's actually something that's really important for us to think about. Climate change is something that is scary. Climate change is going to impact us all. But we can also think of climate change as a chance to change, a chance for a new set of structures. Why not build our cities to be a whole lot more livable than they are today? Why not make our cities designed in such a way that you can actually get around safely and comfortably without all of the noise of the existing transport systems? Why don't we have buildings that are actually covered with vegetation, that are green, and that make a city a whole lot more pleasant to look at? The opportunities, I see one of the questions is looking at questions about technology. In fact, one of the really exciting things we have is the ability to say, not only do we need an energy transition because of climate change, we have these other transitions going on at the same time. We have digitalization going on, we have automation going on, and we can start thinking about how can we connect electricity systems across Europe, and it could be in Canada too, where you say, let's use the maximal efficiency we can get with these digital technologies and pursue the renewable energy and move towards a whole lot more sophisticated next century economy, rather than try to stay on with the old economies of the past that are dirty, that are destroying the environment, that are bad for biodiversity, that are bad for human health. The costs are enormous, and somehow we're hanging on to that. And instead, if we can say, let's envision a future that is going to be something that our kids will be happy to live in, then I think it's a lot easier to persuade people that sometimes you do have to pay a little bit now for the future. Just one last comment. When I was on this committee that was established in 2011 to say what should Germany be doing with its energy future, one of the things we were saying is, yeah, the transition's going to cost a lot, but think about it, a university education costs too. You have to invest now for the long-term future. And maybe we need to think this way about dealing with climate change. We need to invest now because it's for our long-term future. And again, if we don't, the costs are going to probably be a whole lot worse.
Maybe, Miranda, I can tie in one of the questions here about divesting. So there's one about whether, let me see, I just need to find this. Is divestment from fossil fuels on the part of private investors, particularly boomers, a viable strategy is being coordinated for maximum impact? So we just had actually a demonstration here in local Victoria going to the banks and asking to divest and showing alternatives. So is this a viable strategy? And we have another question. In addition to divesting our universities, could universities organize tech in? So, divesting in universities, their pension plans, there are different kind of mechanisms in this respect. So divesting being one strategy, maybe let me tie in one more question, then we come back to our panel. This one is more for you, Ben, about using the court system in the US. Let me just need to find this. About two screens here. Somebody give me 1 second here. Oh, that it was Jody Walsh. Yeah, we have it here. Monica, in the we screened this here. You know that the class action lawsuits against the oil and gas industry are not new to the U.S. Any successes there or things we can learn, encouraging signs from the initiatives in the U.S. courts? So as we know, the U.S., they love the litigation cases and they use the legal system quite extensively also for political purposes. So two questions: the divestment, the scale, the possible impact, the viability also for private investors, and the other one looking at the legal system here, the courts, and what degree of success have we seen in the past? Who wants to go first on that one?
Okay, on the lawsuit one, I'm not aware of any municipality that succeeded at this stage in winning their statement of claim and winning a damages award from a fossil fuel company. But there's many cases that are underway, it's my understanding. The law is inherently conservative and it evolves slowly. And so it's quite typical when you have novel areas of litigation. There's a number of subsidiary issues. And so this type of litigation takes literally years. So for example, in Canada, litigation's been unfolding over the last 20 years relating to provincial governments recovering damages from tobacco companies for the costs on public health and the expenditures that provincial healthcare systems have incurred as a result of illnesses and conditions caused by smoking tobacco. The first successful award resulted just last year, and so that was, some people point to that as being, oh, it's futile, it took 20 years, but ultimately those companies are being held accountable, and there's a reallocation of some of the benefits that the companies received as a result of selling those deadly substances. And in the process, though, a number of other measures have been adopted in terms of various forms of public smoking cessation programs and other measures. And so I think with climate change litigation, it's similar, that I don't think we're going to see a court victory anytime soon. The companies will fight it tooth and nail. They will invest literally potentially billions of dollars in legal strategies. And that will in all likelihood dwarf the financial resources of any government trying to recover costs. But I think ultimately I do anticipate that whether it's municipal governments in Canada or the US, or whether it's more senior levels of government, I think ultimately they will be able to make out a cause of action and recover some of their costs from the polluters. And in the process, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think the positive impact in terms of reapportioning changing the calculus of how fossil fuel companies make their decisions and spurring them because of their requirement to address risk and reduce risk to shareholders as a part of a fiduciary duty of corporate directors to their shareholders, I think we will see a shift in the portfolio and a transition to diversification and other types of economic activities. I don't think we can rest on our laurels and rely on that strategy. I think state action, and this does touch on another question in the chat box, I think really state action is essential if we're going to respond effectively to this climate emergency. And so that means binding legislation to keep the carbon in the ground and to support individuals and local communities and other entities in transitioning rapidly to renewable sources of energy, employment, and economic activity. And so while we should try to reduce, I think, our own carbon footprint just from an ethical standpoint, so I'm taking the train across Canada in 10 days to attend a municipal conference. It'll take 5 days, but my GHG impact footprint will be about 20% of what it would be through air travel. I have that luxury in terms of some flexibility of being able to spend 5 days catching up on emails on a train. But I think we really don't want to fall for the trap of consumer solutions, individual choices being enough. I really think collective responses are the only way we're going to respond effectively to this emergency. Collective at the social movement, civil society level, and collective in terms of state action to keep the carbon in the ground and drive the transition to renewables.
With this, you've also addressed Jon Fedemos' second question here, whether it is, looking at oil companies, whether it is the consumer choices, right? What kind of products do we choose, right? Is this where it hurts them the most, right? It's not through litigation that's, the underlying motivation of the question, but it is really our action choosing purchasing power and so forth. But, Ben, you understood that you have some reservation and some doubt about how far this goes, right? So relying more on state, on collective action, on regulation, rather than on the consumer choosing with their pocketbooks and making choices this way. You can look at change in different ways. Where this is being driven by, and if you look at in the end, profits for private companies, right? Clearly, the consumer choices are an important element of this, but it's an interesting discussion to be have. How far do we go actually with this line of action? Miranda, you're nodding, or maybe you want to comment on that.
If you ask me, I think we need all of it. We need the consumer action, we need the individuals to take action, and we need a lot of pressure, political pressure on decision makers, and we also need pressure on the corporate world. So one of the questions about is it possible to actually have an impact on things like pension systems or on where companies invest? In fact, yes, it's possible. We've seen it happen. We've seen, for example, universities that students have risen up and basically said, we want our universities to divest. Stanford University had a really big and powerful movement in this direction, for example. We've also seen others where they've tried and the universities have said, well, we're not quite ready to do that because they're looking at their bottom line and wondering how they're going to make this transition. But the pressures are building, and in fact, we're starting to see it also in the financial world. One of the really powerful ways to make change would be to require banks to do green investment. If all investment that was tied to any kind of government funding had to pass certain climate and sustainability requirements, it would already have a huge impact on what's going on. And each one of us as individuals can actually take a small step in that direction by saying, well, if I'm going to have a bank account, let me do it in a bank that does green investment. Or if I'm going to buy any stocks, let's make sure those are stocks that are involved in green activities. So as individuals, yes, we can make a difference. And the other way I think we can make a difference is just thinking about how much we consume, because the consumption that we have is also driving a lot of the climate change. We think we've gotten a lot better with environmental protection over the years, but if you look at the expanse we have now of plastics, that's a consumption that also is actually linked to an oil-based economy. We need to think about both how do we change our consumption behavior, our individual lifestyles, but very, very much what do we do to put the pressure on the policymakers, because Ben is right. The regulations set the framework for action, and good regulations can really force change in a much more systematic and often a deeper way than the much slower cultural changes that take often a lot of time. You people listening to this are probably already those who were converted. The problem is, how do we get those who aren't listening to this and aren't the converted, how do we get them on board? And that's where regulation can really make a difference.
There are lots of questions coming in. I'm now watching the clock here with some anxiety, but maybe we can, a couple of more questions I can pose to you. I think, Miranda, you've done research in Asia as well. And there's one question about civil society action, awareness of the challenge of climate change in China. Because, we have clearly a very Western bias here, looking at Europe and North America. If we take a truly global perspective, we heard a little bit from Ben and Latin America, but, one of the big players here, and in China, I'm not sure whether you could briefly speak to this, Miranda. And for Ben, two questions that jumped out at me for this one. One is, it's quite specific about the Canadian context, the collaboration between the environmental movement and the indigenous movement, right? Here in the, with respect to the pipeline, but also more broadly on climate change action. Where do you see the challenges and the promise of bringing two movements into conversation and maybe also a closer collaboration on an important issue, and what are the the challenges of doing this? And Ben, giving your background also with respect to labor history and so forth, there's one question posed now by Sybil Seitzinger about what about thinking about the jobs of those people who might lose their occupation in a fossil-intensive industry, right? Think about the workers in the oil sands in Alberta and so forth. How do we address this issue, right? How do we can we account for people clearly being threatened by moving out of the fossil industry, and how can we tie this, to an awareness of the underlying social and issues involved in shifting the whole industry to becoming more carbon neutral? I'm not sure who wants to start us off. Ben, Miranda. Miranda, do you have any observation on the China context?
Sure, I'd be happy to jump in briefly on that. I spent quite a lot of time in Asia, so that's why Oliver's probably asking me about China. And I'm sitting on an advisory council right now to the Chinese government, and it's looking at the question of how can we do green consumerism in China. When you have 1.4 billion people that will soon be 1.6 billion people, it makes a difference if you can do green consumerism. And so we're looking into ideas such as how can we establish reporting requirements for big companies so that they have to start looking at the ecological footprint of their entire supply chain, which can of course have a big impact on how products are made, how much resources go into those products, including how much energy goes into those products, and even where that energy is coming from. Is China concerned? Yes, I think China's very concerned. I think one is the link between climate change and air pollution. Air quality in Chinese cities is way below World Health Organization safety standards. And on a bad air day in China, you're advised not to even go outside. And that's because of the burning of coal. It's because of the use of oil and gas in transportation. And so one is a health-related concern where people are saying there's a link between air pollution and climate change, we've got to act. And the second is because China is starting to really feel the impacts of climate change. Desertification is a really serious problem for the country. Really hot summer temperatures where not everybody has air conditioning. It's really, really survival questions for weaker people. People who have health problems, who have weak lungs, they have a really hard time surviving in that kind of heat. So yes, in China, you're starting to see a real understanding of a need for change. But that said, the problem's huge. China's also got 65% of its electricity based in coal. So there's still a long ways to go, but there is action. So at least for me, that's a sign of hope. It really is a sign of hope that it's not just Europe, it's not just people starting up in Canada that are saying we need to change. You're seeing it in China and even in India, which is much less developed than China. You're also starting to see growing concern, growing action. So it's become a worldwide movement.
Maybe for the last round, one of the questions was also how can we scale this up, right? How could, they are often you find localized fights and initiatives and social movements. Is it enough? Is it a critical mass? And how could we make this work and having a real political impact? But that's, a fundamental question about, how much of change maker these, smaller social movements, local initiatives are, or is it really the aggregate and, building this momentum that you described, in China and India as well, people but being directly affected, having the tangible sense of what climate change means on the ground, feeling also the existential threat, and then building action upon this. But Ben, I don't want to cut you out there. I have two questions for you more on the social dimensions of climate action, with respect to workers, but also the issue of the collaboration between indigenous people here on the ground and the environment.
Yeah, lots of questions. Fortunately, I know several of the people in this thread, and so I've actually responded to a few of them already, suggesting they give me a call, and because there are some specific questions relating to transportation policy on Vancouver Island, and my general comments on that part of it would be we have to move aggressively towards forms of mobility that involve zero tailpipe emissions. So whether that's road pricing, whether that's different forms of free and improved transit, there's a number of measures, cycling. But happy to dig into those in detail, whether with John or Corey or Saul or Rebecca. So Phil, we can take it offline. But in terms of the questions that Oliver's posed, I think a just transition for affected workers is essential. There is no shortage of employment that's going to have to happen in relation to the climate crisis. So I think it's really a question of political will, ensuring that we're redeploying taxation and potentially increasing taxation. Potentially in Canada, that means a wealth tax. But how do we mobilize sufficient resources so we can put people currently employed in these planet-destroying industries to work building renewables, fueling the renewable revolution? So really, it's not, there's plenty of high-paying, secure opportunities for all of the workers employed in the oil patch and related industries if government decides to act and shift subsidization away from the fossil fuels and ensure adequate resources for the whole range of renewables in terms of the generation of energy, the conversion of existing buildings, green transportation, and all the other measures that climate action encompasses. Mm-hmm. The question around the indigenous movement is a great one and an extremely important one. I touched on it briefly in my presentation. I think we're making some progress here. It's happening more at the grassroots level. There are good relationships emerging between indigenous governments and local governments. Those conversations aren't focusing all that much on climate action. They're focusing at this stage on questions around reconciliation. And I think a part of that reflects the huge amount of responsibilities that have been imposed on Indian Act band councils in Canada in terms of responsibilities that in the settler society are spread between 4 levels of government. These small indigenous communities, in some cases of a few hundred people, are responsible for everything from their roads and their sewers to their health and education systems. And so there's very little capacity to be tackling climate issues, although there are many indigenous communities on this island and elsewhere that are taking climate change seriously, and we need more collaboration. So I think collaboration at all levels with the official leadership of these communities, with traditional forms of leadership, and with the grassroots, both on and off reserve. And on the settler side, people participating individually, collectively, through grassroots groups. 2 people as a group, knock on your neighbor's door, form a group, and see what you can do to make climate action in partnership with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but also collectively in terms of local government and other levels of government. And post-secondary definitely has a role to play there. I think just in terms of the scaling up, I think the bioregional level really is the level where we can make the most change. And it's also, I think, the level that can be most resilient in the post sort of carbon emergency. And so I think focusing on what we can do in our own regions in an area where I've heard it described as you could be attending a meeting in no less or no more than an hour. So essentially an hour proximity by train, ideally by electric car if you have to, but focusing on that scale. And if we can get our act together in each of these bioregions, then there's the question of how do we sort of federate these bioregions together to work effectively. There is national action happening. There's an intermunicipal climate leadership committee that has about 50 participants. And so there is coordination at the local government level across the country. And the comment that we are seeing results, did we think that the government of Theresa May would embrace a climate emergency? Like, that's a direct product of the Extinction Rebellion civil disobedience movement in London last month. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Direct action got the goods in that case. And here in Canada, there's indications that later this week, the government of Canada might be declaring a climate emergency. So governments of all levels are certainly feeling the pressure, and that's a signal to me and hopefully to everyone on this conference that it's time to turn up the heat. So globally, as a planet, we can turn down the heat.
Right, yeah. The metaphor of turning up the heat might not be the most appropriate for climate change.
Ultimately.
Here you go. Miranda, any final reflection? We're coming to the end of this, but please, Miranda, if you want to take another minute or two, if there's any final thought. We can't get to every single question, so sorry about this, but Ben was already so generous to offer, look, you can follow up with him, more specific question about transport and the city level. Miranda, after having shared all this wonderful examples from the European context, but it seems, before I give the word to you, it seems the issues are very, very similar, and we see quite a comparable challenges, political opportunities on both sides of the Atlantic here, and you can easily speak to an audience here in the Canadian context. So it has become a truly global issue that is being taken up by different communities at different scales of government with very similar practices. So Miranda, any final reflection? You've seen some of the questions here. I think that you would like to pick up at the end.
I think one of the questions was how do you keep this kind of thing going? And for one, I think we should be thanking you, Oliver, because having this kind of webinar is one of those steps that can be taken to give these kinds of discussions more visibility in more places. One of the questions was, how do we bring this kind of activity more into rural communities? And obviously this kind of technology gives us possibilities we've never had before. And I think that's probably also one reason that we have seen Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future take off in the ways they have, because social media now allows people to communicate with each other in ways we've never had before. The speed of communication that you have in no time. Extinction Rebellion offices in 50 different countries, more or less. That's really amazing. So I think what that suggests is that all of us can play a role in making this change happen. And I think Ben was absolutely right. Don't just wait around for somebody else to take action. Think about what you yourself can do to mobilize that action. Don't think about doing it all by yourself. Get some friends. It's a lot more fun that way. And let's together.
On this very encouraging note, I would like to greatly thank the two of you. Miranda, it's getting late in Europe, but thank you very much for your time. Ben, thank you, and all of you online. Thank you for joining us. Ben and Miranda, you can't hear the applause; it's all virtual. But thank you so much for this, and hopefully this will be viewed also into the future and be an instrument of spreading the news about the issue. So thank you very much, and have a good day.